250 years ago, America was nothing close to a superpower. It was a fragile experiment made up of just 13 colonies, surrounded by empires that were older, richer, and far more powerful. Yet somehow, that experiment would grow into one of the most powerful nations in human history. So what changed? Was it America's enormous land, its resources, its people, or something nobody could have predicted in 1776? Because the story of how America became a superpower is far more unlikely than you think. Before America became a country, it was a collection of 13 British colonies along the eastern coast of North America. They were part of the British Empire, one of the most powerful empires on Earth. But by the 1760s, the relationship was beginning to change. Britain had spent enormous amounts of money fighting the French in North America and elsewhere. Now it wanted the colonies to help pay the cost. New taxes were introduced, and many colonists began asking a simple question. If Britain could tax them, why couldn't they have a greater say in the decisions being made for them? The dispute grew. Protests turned into resistance. Resistance turned into open conflict. And in 1776, the colonies made a decision that seemed almost impossible. They declared themselves independent. But declaring independence was one thing. Defending it against the British Empire was another. The Revolutionary War became a brutal test of whether this new experiment could survive. George Washington led the Continental Army, while France eventually entered the war against Britain, providing crucial military and financial support to the American cause. In 1783, Britain recognized American independence. The 13 colonies had survived, but they had inherited a massive problem. They were now an independent nation, without the wealth, military strength, or established institutions of Europe's great powers. America had won its freedom, but freedom was only the beginning. Now it had to figure out how to become a country powerful enough to survive on its own. America had won its independence, but the country was still relatively small. Then something happened that would completely change its future. The map began to grow. In 1803, President Thomas Jefferson agreed to purchase the vast Louisiana territory from France for $15 million. The deal nearly doubled the size of the United States. But this wasn't simply empty land waiting to be claimed. Indigenous nations already lived across these territories, with their own governments, cultures, and economies. As the United States expanded westward, those nations faced increasing pressure, displacement, and conflict. Meanwhile, American settlers continued moving toward the Pacific. New territories were added through purchases, treaties, settlement, and war. Texas joined the United States. The war with Mexico brought enormous territories into American control, including California and the Southwest. And in 1867, the United States purchased Alaska from Russia for $7.2 million. At the time, critics mocked the deal. But America now possessed something extraordinary: an enormous continental landmass, fertile farmland, vast forests, rivers, minerals, oil, and coastlines opening toward both the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. The United States was no longer just a collection of former colonies. It was becoming a continental nation with resources on a scale few countries could match. But there was a problem. A huge country is not automatically a powerful country. America now had the land. The question was whether it could turn that land into something far more powerful, before its own internal divisions tore it apart. America was growing larger. But beneath that growth was a conflict it could not escape: slavery. As the United States expanded westward, a difficult question became impossible to avoid. Would the new territories allow slavery? Or would they remain free? Every new state could change the balance of political power between the North and the South. For decades, compromises kept the country together. But the disagreements kept getting deeper. By the 1850s, political compromise was beginning to collapse. Then, in 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected president. Southern states feared that their political future was being threatened. One after another, they declared secession and formed the Confederate States of America. In 1861, the conflict became war. The American Civil War would become the deadliest conflict in American history. For 4 years, Americans fought Americans. Cities and railroads were destroyed. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers died. And in the middle of the war, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, transforming the conflict into a struggle that would also destroy slavery in the rebelling states. In 1865, the Confederacy collapsed. The Union survived. Slavery was abolished. But America had paid an enormous price for remaining one country. And something important had changed. The United States had survived its greatest internal crisis and emerged with its territory intact, its political system preserved, and its industrial regions increasingly connected. The country was finally positioned for something extraordinary, an economic transformation that would change America's place in the world. After the Civil War, America entered a completely different era. The country had survived its greatest internal crisis. Now its enormous territory needed something that could connect it all. Railroads. Tracks began stretching across the continent, linking farms, mines, factories, and cities that had once been separated by enormous distances. Raw materials could move faster. Goods could reach distant markets. And people could travel across the country in ways that had been impossible only decades earlier. At the same time, America's natural resources began feeding a rapidly expanding industrial economy. Coal-powered factories. Oil became increasingly important. Iron and steel built railways, bridges, machines, and cities. Electricity transformed factories and everyday life. And millions of immigrants arrived, providing workers for America's expanding industries while creating rapidly growing cities and markets. Then came one of the biggest changes of all. Mass production. Factories were no longer simply making individual products. They were learning how to make thousands of them. Faster, cheaper, and at a scale that could reach ordinary Americans. Henry Ford's moving assembly line became one of the most famous examples of this transformation. America now had something more powerful than land or natural resources alone. It had a system connecting resources, transportation, workers, factories, capital, and consumers into one enormous economy. By the beginning of the 20th century, the United States had become one of the world's leading industrial powers. But economic strength creates a new kind of influence, and America was about to discover that its growing power could no longer remain confined to its own continent. The world was starting to pay attention. By the beginning of the 20th century, America was no longer just a rising industrial nation. Its factories were producing enormous quantities of steel, machinery, weapons, and consumer goods. And that economic power was beginning to reach far beyond America's borders. The United States became increasingly involved in international affairs. Then came World War I. America entered the conflict in 1917, and its soldiers and industrial capacity helped strengthen the Allied war effort. But after the war, America did something unusual. It pulled back from much of European politics, even as its economic influence continued to grow. Then everything changed again. In 1941, the United States entered World War II. This time, America didn't simply send an army overseas. It turned its entire industrial system toward war. Factories produced aircraft, ships, tanks, trucks, weapons, and ammunition on an extraordinary scale. American industry became one of the most important engines of the Allied war effort. And when the war ended in 1945, the world looked completely different. Much of Europe and parts of Asia had been devastated. The United States had suffered enormous losses too, but its industrial heartland had remained largely intact. Its economy was enormous. Its military was powerful, and it possessed the world's first atomic bombs. More importantly, America was now helping shape the institutions and economic system of the post-war world. The country that had once been a collection of colonies had become one of the two dominant powers on Earth. But being a great power and being a superpower were not quite the same thing. The final transformation was about to begin. And this time, America wasn't just going to influence the world. It was going to help define the rules of it. After World War II, America had something no previous chapter of its history had ever produced at the same time. Enormous economic power, military strength, global alliances, and international influence. But one rival stood in its way: the Soviet Union. The two countries entered a new struggle known as the Cold War. It wasn't a traditional war between American and Soviet armies. Instead, the competition spread across military power, nuclear weapons, technology, space, economics, and influence around the world. America also helped build a new international system. The Bretton Woods system placed the U.S. dollar at the center of global finance. The United States helped establish institutions such as the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, while the creation of NATO connected America militarily with key European allies. Then came the space race. In 1969, American astronauts reached the moon, turning technological competition into one of the most visible demonstrations of national power in history. For decades, America and the Soviet Union competed for influence across the planet. But in 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. America was left as the world's dominant military and economic power. And that brings us back to the question we started with. How did a country that began with just 13 colonies become a global superpower? It wasn't because of one president, one war, or one lucky decision. It was the result of 250 years of accumulation. Independence gave America a beginning. Expansion gave it scale. Surviving the Civil War preserved the Union. Industrialization gave it economic power. And the wars and institutions of the 20th century turned that power into global influence. America didn't become a superpower overnight. It built that position, generation after generation. And perhaps that's what makes its rise so unlikely and so extraordinary. Han thodi repetition hai, tumbilkal salipaka raho. Chapter 6 already says, 13 colonies right arrow superpower. 250 years of accumulation. Independence right arrow expansion, right arrow Civil War, right arrow industrialization, right arrow global influence. America didn't become a superpower overnight. Generation after generation. The most surprising part of America's story isn't simply how powerful it became. It's how completely the world around it changed. While that experiment was still becoming a nation. And 250 years later, the question is no longer whether America can shape history. It's what it will choose to do with that power next.